Oh, Nick, what are you going to do now that MHA and JJK are over? Is the Weeb Commander going to have anything left to post? Yeah. Duh. You think I can't post about JJK because the manga's over? I've been posting about Naruto, and that manga's been over for 7 years, for 4 years now. I started NZ Hammer after Naruto's manga and anime had finished. And while there is objectively less to talk about in JJK than there is in Naruto, I could talk about this manga for years to come. I can craft theories, do ranked videos, do deep dives on individual characters. The only thing that this manga ending has accomplished is now I don't get to do manga reviews for the JJK manga releases. And that sucks because I'm lazy and manga content is incredibly easy, but then again, so are ranking videos. Now, they are harder than manga content, but I kind of just write 10 names down and freeball it. And thus today, we're hopping back on the JJK bandwagon, because now that JJK's manga is over and there is no promise of a sequel, we are permanently in what I refer to as the best possible situation for power scaling, explaining, and theories. We, as it currently stands, have as much JJK information as we will ever get, which means it's about time that we, and by we I mean I, got our act together and use the definitive information that we have that will never change to truly do some accurate rankings. And thus, now that I know everything that I will ever know about JJK, I figured it was time to sit down and bang out one of the big hitters. Because today we're talking the top 10 strongest characters in JJK, ranked and explained. But before we get to ranking or explaining anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you want to see me try to bring real-life challenges to the anime world, go ahead and follow the brand new channel that I created with Stephen Heat, Chris Barnett, and Danny Mata called Anime IRL. Or if you just want to hear me talk about anime and manga, go ahead and follow my anime podcast, Talkers Anonymous, where me and Danny Mata break down everything that happened in anime and manga this week. It's available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. So, the dust is settled on JJK as a story. The sorcerers who are going to survive, survived, and the sorcerers who have died aren't coming back. Looking directly at you, Gojo stands. Theories and endings that we hoped to come to fruition, well, didn't. And the manga left the majority of the fan base with a somewhat sour taste in their mouth. However, there is a silver lining to a manga ending in any capacity, be it widely beloved or widely maligned. And that is that people like me finally have all the information that we'll ever have to make the lists that we love making. And really, there's no better place to start than by ranking the top 10 sorcerers from Jujutsu Kaisen, because we now have the sum total of all the feats that these sorcerers will pull off, and they'll never get stronger. But enough build up, let's get into the list. But before we get to the top 10, I'd like to do at least one honorable mention. And that honorable mention goes to none other than Maki Zenny. Maki, to me at least, is a somewhat unfortunate character in JJK. While she does hold on to some of the hypest moments in all of JJK, like the eradication of the Zenin clan and the stabbing of Sukuna's heart, I wish in the final act she played a somewhat more prevalent role in the battle against Sukuna, or even the battle against Kenjaku. However, the lack, at least according to me, of her presence in these key battles doesn't necessarily mean that she's weaker than a lot of the other people who were involved in these battles. Maki has multiple times been stated to either be equal to Toji in strength or greater. And considering the fact that Toji was able to eliminate a pre-awoken Gojo, that's saying something. Pretty much all of Maki's most impressive feats come from either the eradication of the Zenin clan or anything that happens after that. As Maki during the eradication of the Zenin clan is able to cut down the entirety of the Kukuru unit, a unit of highly advanced Jujutsu sorcerers that existed within the Zenin clan, she was able to casually dispatch of the Hei, which was a unit within the Zenin clan that was comprised of either semi-grade 1 sorcerers or grade 1 sorcerers in its entirety, was able to battle against and cut down Naoya both as a human and as a cursed womb, sumo wrestled with Rokuju Shimayo, a person who came back to fight in the Culling game specifically to sumo wrestle against people, battled against 16-finger Sukuna when he took over Megami's body and was able to pressure him to the point where Sukuna felt as though he needed to dodge and block Maki's attacks, and was able to, multiple times during the fight against 19-finger Sukuna, injure him. The most notable time being the second that Yuta's domain expansion was broken, she was able to speed blitz Sukuna and strike him through the heart, destroying it. However, unfortunately, Maki never played what I would consider a massive role in the fight against Sukuna outside of destroying his heart, which in the grand scheme of things really didn't accomplish all that much because he was able to keep it pumping manually. In fact, Maki of her own volition admits the fact that she wasn't that much of a help in the fight, considering the fact that she let herself get hit by 2 separate black flashes. However, this in itself is impressive for Maki that she was able to survive 2 separate black flashes from Sukuna. However, the Kusakabe Coalition didn't consider Maki strong enough to cut down Kenjaku, Kaku, or strong enough to cut down all of the cursed spirits that would have poured out of Kenjaku when decapitated, which is why they sent Yuta. And if the Kusakabe Coalition doesn't have that much faith in Maki, then why should I? But because I love her, and because she's definitely powerful, Maki gets an honorable mention. Which brings us to our first spot on this list, which I guess could also be referred to as our last spot on this list, Higuruma. Now, Higuruma being able to achieve the number 10 spot on this list is very impressive when you consider the fact that he only became a Jujutsu sorcerer at the beginning of the Culling games. See, Higuruma is an awakened type sorcerer, meaning he had the brain to control cursed energy, but never went through the actual mutation to control it. Now, as a combatant, Higuruma is massively impressive. So impressive, in fact, that the Kusakabe Coalition's plan for defeating Sukuna was, if Gojo is defeated, send Yuji and Higuruma. Now, obviously, Kashimo dashed in there the second that Gojo was cut down because he wanted his chance at defeating Sukuna. But the Kusakabe Coalition's plan was to send Higuruma and Yuji, meaning the Kusakabe Coalition genuinely believed that if Gojo couldn't get the job done, that Yuji and Higuruma would be able to capitalize on a possibly weakened Sukuna. Now, this doesn't necessarily pan out, but not because Higuruma is weak. See, because the plan for the Kusakabe Coalition was for Higuruma to enact his domain expansion, Judge Man. And upon the activation of this domain expansion, Sukuna, Higuruma, and Yuji would all have a non-violence clause placed on them, meaning that they wouldn't be able to fight until Judge Man made a ruling that the Kusakabe Coalition believed would end in Sukuna being stripped of his cursed energy and Higuruma being given the Executioner's Blade. And the Kusakabe Coalition believed that if Sukuna didn't have cursed energy, Higuruma had the Executioner Blade and Yuji by his side, that Yuji and Higuruma stood a fairly good chance at defeating Sukuna. And they would have if Gege hadn't Gege. See, because even though Higuruma did get the sentencing that he was looking for, Sukuna wasn't stripped of his cursed energy. No, he was stripped of a cursed tool that he never used. And thus Higuruma and Yuji had to battle against a true version form of Sukuna who had healed from his battle against Gojo, while he still had access to the entirety of his cursed energy. And they did good. In fact, they did so good that they forced Sukuna to cut off one of his own hands. And Sukuna was so impressed with Higuruma that he actively compared him to Gojo, as Higuruma, over the course of just these couple of months of being a sorcerer, had not only figured out exactly how to augment his cursed energy to make it more or less effective in certain moments, but had also cracked the code on RCT. And thus Sukuna stated that Higuruma was a genius on par with Gojo, at least when it came to cursed energy manipulation. However, this unfortunately doesn't stop Higuruma from getting the big old X of, I guess, well, not death from Sukuna, but the fact that Higuruma was able to tank multiple attacks from Sukuna, recuperate from all of them using RCT, and then survive a full powered attack from Sukuna and live on to see the ending of JJK is very impressive. And when you consider the fact that Higuruma's ability, the Executioner Sword, put Sukuna in a situation where he could have died twice, I unfortunately have to put him higher than Maki, who only put Sukuna in a situation where he could die once. But enough about public defendants, nobody cares about them. Let's talk about our number 9 entry on this list. Megami. Now, if you're upset that I put Megami above Higuruma, genuinely can't really blame you. Megami does have some feats, but most of the most important chapters in the entirety of JJK revolve around him not being in control of his own body. See, unfortunately, even though Megami survives the bath and battles back against Sukuna, we don't really get to see how strong Megami is post-Sukuna. And therefore, all we can really use to scale Megami is everything that happens to him previous to being taken over by Sukuna. And for all intents and purposes, prior to being taken over by Sukuna, Megami was a grade 1 sorcerer or higher. His divine dog Totality Shikigami was able to harm the likes of Hanami, a special grade cursed spirit. He was able to defeat the Finger Bearer under the Yasuichi Bridge, which was another special grade cursed spirit, and he for a long time was the only out of the first years who had anything even remotely resembling a domain expansion. See, because Megami unlocked an incomplete domain expansion pretty early on into the story. A domain expansion that, mind you, allowed for Megami to defeat Jeffree Star, a reincarnated type sorcerer in the Culling games who was very powerful. And that's kind of Megami's most impressive victory. It's Reggistar. I'm mixing up Reggistar with the guy who does makeup or something. I don't know. Dorothy watches them sometimes. Anyways, Megami's ability to defeat Reggistar, who was one of the more powerful sorcerers from his time period, proved that through the usage of Chimera Shadow Garden, Megami was legit. I mean, if Megami uses Chimera Shadow Garden in an enclosed space like a gymnasium, he's able to essentially complete his domain expansion, flooding his shadows along the walls and grounds and ceiling of whatever place he's at. And within the confines of his own domain expansion, he gets 120% boost to his cursed energy. He's able to create any Shikigami that he wants from the shadows that he's projecting either on the floor or all around him. He's able to make clones of himself, and anybody who doesn't apply cursed energy to the bottom of their feet falls into the bottomless well of his shadows. Tie this into the fact that Megami is able to control all of the shadows of the 10 Shadows technique outside of Maharaga, and it would make sense why Sukuna was so incredibly interested in having Megami as a vessel. But enough about Sukuna's vessels, what about his children? Kind of. Because coming up at number 8, we have Arame. Arame is a reincarnated type sorcerer in the Culling Games, and a sorcerer who reincarnated into the Culling Games with the explicit idea of helping Sukuna take over the world, because Arame is just as old as Sukuna, being 1,000+ years old. Now, Arame's Jujutsu is quite straightforward, at least so far as anime powers go. Arame is able to create and control ice, and whether that's creating a freezing mist in their mouth and blowing it towards an enemy, freezing them immediately, or making gigantic ice spikes that fall from the sky onto their opponents, when it comes down to elemental control using Jujutsu, Arame is pretty much the gold standard. Ties into the fact that Arame is also a master of RCT, and Arame is a real, genuine threat, even though we don't get to see that much from them combat-wise. See, because while Arame has shown feats like being able to block Chozo's piercing blood and brush aside Momo's wind sight, unfortunately, Arame's most important fight we never get to see, as Arame is known to be battling against Hikari for basically the entirety of the Sukuna battle, and really outside of that fight, the only time that Arame plays a critical role in any battle is when Arame steps in between Yuji, Maki, and 16-finger Sukuna, using an ice formation Frost Calm at max output to freeze the entirety of the battleground that the three of them were battling on, pretty much locking Maki into place and stopping Yuji from being able to pursue Sukuna, who rides away on Nue. However, during the Shibuya incident, Arame was able to shut down the second years and the Kyoto students pretty much instantaneously. On top of this, Arame was too much for Yuji to overtake. And thus, when it really boils down to it, the most impressive thing that Arame ever did was not lose to Hikari, as Hikari and Arame's fight ended as a stalemate because Sukuna died before their fight ended. Considering the fact that a weaker version of Hikari, that is a version of Hikari that didn't have a couple of months to train leading up to the Sukuna battle, was strong enough to defeat Kashimo in a battle one-on-one when Kashimo was the strongest sorcerer of his era 400 years ago, means the fact that Hikari was unable to win against Arame means that Arame is the real deal. And yet, because I'm a gambling man, I'd reckon that Hikari is still stronger. And that's why at our number 7 spot, we have Hikari. Now, a couple of you are just now realizing that Kashimo is not in the top 10. I mean, if Hikari beat Kashimo, and therefore Hikari is stronger than Kashimo, and Kashimo wasn't between 7 and 10, then that means that Kashimo isn't on the list. And you're right, he's not. He gets one-shot by a weakened Sukuna. He loses to Hikari prior to Hikari going through a training arc. If anything, I would arguably say that Kashimo's weaker than Maki, because Maki has tanked no less than 5 full-strength blows from Sukuna, 2 of which were black flashes. But enough about Kashimo. Let's talk about the man who defeated Kashimo, the lover of femboys, Kinji Hikari. Hikari's got about as impressive as a resume as anybody in JJK. He's widely recognized as one of the most powerful students in Jujutsu High. Gojo stated that the only person outside of Yuta that would have the power to rival his one day would be Hikari, and he backs all of this up every time he enters into a fight. See, because while Hikari was able to battle against people like Yuji and absolutely beat the snot out of him in the perfect preparation arc, really when it comes down to it, Hikari's most impressive feats come either during the Culling Games or during the Sukuna arc. See, because while everybody wants to talk about how Hikari was able to defeat Kashimo, they also forget that during the Culling arc, Hikari also defeated Charles Bernard. And while Charles Bernard is definitely not as strong as Kashimo, Hikari didn't know anything about G Warstaff heading into this battle against Charles. And it's not until Charles explains to Hikari that he's able to see further and further into Hikari's future, the more blood he draws into G Warstaff, that Hikari begins to realize that Charles may be a legitimate contender in a fight. However, upon hearing how G Warstaff works, Hikari immediately thinks up a counterplan, disappearing from Charles's sight and appearing behind him and striking him in the back. See, because Hikari realizes that Charles can't predict what he can't see. And while I don't really think that Hikari needed to use Idle Death Gamble to defeat Charles, Hikari loves his domain expansion, and so every fight he gets into, he's gonna open it up, if only probably to info dump about Pachinko. And even though Charles is able to land what would be a deadly blow on everybody who's not named Hikari in Idle Death Gamble, after hitting a jackpot and gaining access to his infinite cursed energy, Hikari kicks straight through Charles' defenses and destroys G Warstaff. But this isn't where Hikari's feats end, as we also know that Hikari's high intellect, serrated cursed energy, and unwillingness to die also allowed him to defeat Kashimo, one of the strongest sorcerers Kenjaku met over 1,000 years of looking. And while some would say that Hikari won because the fight ended up in the water and Kashimo's CEs electrified, that all kind of boils down to intellect. But even if you want to say that Hikari won on a technicality against Kashimo, Hikari proved his mettle by being able to battle against Arame, one of the very few people that Sukuna ever respected enough to not kill instantaneously, and Hikari was able to battle Arame to a standstill, and technically came out the victor of that battle because at the end of the battle, Arame unalived themselves. But all the luck in the world doesn't make Hikari as strong as our number 5 spot on this list, because coming up at number 5, I mean 6, is Todo. Yeah, I'm saying that Todo's stronger than Hikari. Sue me. Yeah, I understand that Gojo never said that Todo would someday reach his potential or power, but pretty much every time that Todo shows up in the story of JJK, he just immediately trounces on whatever mega antagonist Yuji or anybody else is currently battling against. See, whether it's Hanami, Mahito, or Sukuna himself, Todo's Boogie Woogie ability has confounded some of the strongest cursed spirits in the entirety of this story. See, because like it or not, the only reason that Hanami doesn't absolutely rip through the students of Jujutsu High is because Todo uses his Boogie Woogie with Yuji and they run a fade on that tree. The only reason that Yuji doesn't give in to despair and therefore lose in a battle against Mahito is because Todo shows up, does the hardest lat spread we've ever seen outside of All Might lat spreading to increase his speed in the second MHA movie, and helping Yuji turn into the furry that he's always wanted to be, chasing after his little bunny that is Mahito. And by the time that the Sukuna arc comes around, even though Todo lost his hand in the battle against Mahito and said that the Boogie Woogie was dead, the Boogie Woogie was not, in fact, dead, because Todo attached a thingamabob to his hand, and the thingamabob allowed him to use Boogie Woogie 50 times a second, a technique that was so incredibly aggravating that even Sukuna, the king of curses, didn't know how to react to it. And really the only reason that Todo was taken out of this battle against Sukuna is because he had to make sure that Hana didn't die. I genuinely do believe that if they had just sent Todo and Yuji in after Gojo had died, they probably would have killed Sukuna. Yes, I understand that Sukuna was in a massively disadvantageous state when Todo and Yuji were jumping him. He couldn't open his domain, he couldn't use reverse curse technique. But I genuinely believe that Todo and Yuji and possibly some other people would be able to land such a flurry of attacks on Sukuna in the beginning of that fight, he wouldn't have had time to open his domain. Boogie Woogie is elite, and so is Todo. That's why he's 6. Also, Todo survives multiple attacks from Sukuna. But since we're talking about Todo, we might as well talk about his brother, Yuji. Listen, Yuji's a weird one. I understand that he's the MC of this story, but placing him at 5 does feel kind of wrong. And not because I believe he should be higher. He should not be higher. But because I believe he should actually maybe be lower. See, here's what Yuji has going for him. He's kind of like Kurapika. Kurapika is an incredibly powerful Nen user in Hunter x Hunter. However, Kurapika can't necessarily be considered one of the strongest offensive type Nen users in Hunter x Hunter unless he's fighting a spider. Yuji is strong, undoubtedly one of the strongest sorcerers in all of JJK. However, the bulk of the reasoning as to why I believe Yuji would be in the top 5 of strongest sorcerers in JJK is because of how he fared in a battle against Sukuna. But here's the thing. Yuji's kit is specifically made to be effective against Sukuna. See, the rest of Yuji's fights be damned, because none of them are as important as the battle against Sukuna. What Yuji does pull off in the battle against Sukuna is obviously very impressive. When it comes down to it, every iteration of a fight against Sukuna that didn't involve Gojo involved Yuji. And whether it was Yuji landing punches that were able to reach to Megami Soul in Yuta's domain expansion, landing 8 black flashes against Sukuna in a mall while battling alongside Ino and Maki, or using Todo's Boogie Woogie to absolutely jump Sukuna every time somebody new pulled up the battle against Sukuna, Yuji was there. And that applied to the final person who pulled up the battle against Sukuna, Nobara. And thus Yuji's feats against Sukuna absolutely have to be taken into account. But in his battle against Sukuna, I more look at his durability as opposed to his AP. See, because of the lag effect of Yuji's cursed energy, Yuji's punches had the ability to directly attack the soul of people like Mahito and Sukuna. And considering the fact that Mahito's entire thing was soul control and Sukuna was controlling a vessel, those attacks were specifically powerful against those two people. And thus in terms of the AP that Yuji was able to inflict on people like Mahito and Sukuna has to be taken with a somewhat small grain of salt, especially when you consider the fact that Yuji did get access to the shrine by spending so much time with Sukuna, but really he constrained his usage of the shrine down to being able to use Dismantle on the barrier between Megami and Sukuna's souls, a technique that he baked into his own domain expansion. And thus basically everything about Yuji's kit boiled down to being able to defeat Sukuna, much in the same way that some of the most useful parts of Kurapika's Nen chains boiled down to him only being able to use them against spiders. However, none of this takes away from Yuji's durability. Yuji tanks cleaves, dismantles, black flashes, and so much more from Sukuna, and every single time gets back up. In fact, I would say that Yuji's durability is probably higher than anybody else in the JJK world, except for possibly Sukuna. And it was revealed in the Sukuna arc by training with Yuta and Chozo that Yuji was able to tap into the power of him being a cursed womb, meaning that he had an almost limitless amount of cursed energy that he was able to use to pull off things like RCT. And thus, while yes, Yuji is highly responsible for the defeat of Sukuna, to say that he did it on his own is is a stretch, and to say that he was even really the thing that ended up killing Sukuna in the end is also kind of a stretch, as it was more so the compounded injuries of the battle against Gojo, Maki stabbing his heart out, the second battle against Gojo, and Nobura's resonance, though obviously Yuji's contribution to the battle cannot be ignored. And so I feel like 5 is safe for him, because at number 4 we have Kenjaku, and I know Yuji wouldn't be able to beat Kenjaku in a 1v1. Now for those of you who are saying Kenjaku's a cursed spirit, I mean, like, kind of, but he's also an ancient cursed user, and so I like to consider him in both categories. Now Kenjaku did kind of end up as a disappointment if we're being real. After mussing about with Takaba for a little bit, he gets decapitated by Yuta, and that's basically the end of Kenjaku. Sukuna inherits his will and then does nothing with it, and then boom, that's the end of the story of the guy who's supposed to be the main antagonist of the story. When it really comes down to it, the most impressive battle that Kenjaku ever has is when he battles against Yuki and Chozo simultaneously. And he comes out victorious in this battle, mind you. And that's no small feat when you consider the fact that Yuki is one of the 4 special grade sorcerers we've ever known in JJK, and her curse technique Star Rage allowed her to make black holes that could have destroyed the entire planet. Ties into the fact that Chozo is absolutely a special grade curse spirit and possibly the greatest blood manipulator we've ever seen in JJK. The fact that Kenjaku was able to come out victorious against these two, and rather handedly, mind you, especially when you consider the fact that Tengen, the entity that maintains all of the barriers across Japan that stop Japan from being overrun by cursed spirits, was also kind of in the mix in this battle, is a very, very impressive feat. Even though Chozo is able to survive this battle because Yuki tells him to live on, Kenjaku is successful in the killing of Yuki and successful in the escaping of the black hole that she creates, which is an absolutely insane feat. It comes from the fact that Kenjaku's body swapping technique allows him to carry on techniques from all the bodies he's had previously, and therefore whether it's anti-gravity or Geto's curse manipulation, Kenjaku's bag is as deep as anybody's in the JJK universe, which is why Kenjaku was even able to use the domain expansion of Geto, Womb Perfusion, a domain expansion that we didn't know was Geto's until Yuta used Gojo's domain expansion when he was controlling his body. Now this technically isn't even the first time that Kenjaku had battled against Chozo, as at the end of the Shibuya incident, Kenjaku battled against people like Miwa and Chozo for a little bit. But really when it comes down to it, Kenjaku's biggest fight in the manga is the fight that he has against Takaba, a fight that Kenjaku technically wins. However, when you consider the fact that Takaba doesn't kill with his curse technique comedian, then there was really never a circumstance in which Kenjaku could lose. Like, yes, Takaba switching situations was incurring damage to Kenjaku's body, but Takaba wasn't even doing this intentionally. He was just trying to make comedic scenes with somebody he found funny in Kenjaku. And immediately after Kenjaku has the time of his life with Chozo, Yuta, with the help of Todo, sneaks up on Kenjaku and decapitates him with one swoop, which inevitably leads to the death of Kenjaku because he can't use RCT, something that he very neatly pointed out to us in the fight that he had a couple of chapters prior to his own death against Iori. But just because Kenjaku didn't necessarily live up to the hype of being the strongest sorcerer of all time, doesn't mean that he wasn't the strongest sorcerers we ever saw in JJK. Just not as strong as a couple of others. Like our number 3 entry on this list, Yuta. If we're being real, Yuta got snuffed. Like, I get that Yuta is in the main character of the story. I get that Yuta was supposed to be the main character of the story, but then Yuji was created, so Yuta was sidelined kind of, but Yuta got snuffed. Not only was Yuta the centerpiece of inarguably one of, if not the greatest fight in the entirety of this manga, Yuta versus Takako and Ryu, but Yuta was, outside of Todo, probably the MVP of the Sukuna arc. See, Yuta's been doing the heavy lifting for this story since before Yuji was even in the story. In Chapter 0, it was Yuta who defeated Geto, countering a maximum Uzumaki fired by Geto by giving his life to Rika, putting Geto in a situation that allowed for Gojo to finish him off and then not take care of his body. Yuta also during the Yuji extermination arc pulls up on Yuji, beats the hell out of him, kills him, and then immediately brings him back to life. Also, the binding vow that he made with the elders would be null and void, and Yuji wouldn't be dead. But really when it comes down to it, Yuta started doing a lot of the heavy lifting in the culling games, where Yuta battled against the cockroach cursed spirit Kororoshi and came out victorious. And he didn't stop there as he battled in 2v1 versus Takoko, the head of the Sun and Star Squad from 1,000 years ago. Mind you, the Sun and Star Squad was specifically the squad assigned to taking out Sukuna, and Ryu, a guy who was able to fire incredibly powerful lasers with his pompadour. Takoko and Ryu were some of the strongest sorcerers in the culling games, with Ryu's granite laser and Takoko's ability to grab the sky and augment it. And Yuta, just using his cursed techniques, cursed energy, Rika, and copy, was able to defeat the both of them simultaneously. Because this was all before Yuta even started using his domain expansion, True Mutual Love. Domain expansion that littered all of the cursed techniques he's ever copied into katanas scattered about a giant battlefield so that Yuta could grab these cursed techniques and use them whenever he wanted. Mind you, his domain expansion also allows for him to add an innate technique to his domain. And since he allowed for Rika to consume part of Hana, he was able to put Jacob's Ladder on this domain. But it wouldn't even have to be Jacob's Ladder, because if he wasn't battling against a cursed spirit and rather a cursed technique user, he could always place another cursed technique in his domains. And that technique, assuming the other person wasn't opening a domain of their own, would have a sure hit effect. Tie all this into the fact that Rika consumed the entirety of Kenjaku's body, and Yuta now technically has Kenjaku's body swapping technique. And while that's not the greatest technique of all time to copy, because after 5 or so minutes in somebody's body, his copy technique burns out and then he would die inside of that body, it should technically mean that any body he transfers into, so long as he transfers back into his original body, he should get the cursed techniques of the body he transferred into, because that's an aspect of Kenjaku's body swapping technique. He holds on to the cursed techniques, memories, and fighting abilities of all of the bodies he's transferred into. So hypothetically, whenever Yuta accesses Kenjaku's body swapping technique, he doesn't necessarily have to swap out of his body, but for 5 or so minutes, he should be able to access Gojo's techniques. And if that's not something you've ever thought of, well, now it is. But Yuta showed us pretty concretely that being able to copy Gojo's techniques didn't make you Gojo, which is why at the spot directly above Yuta at number 2 is Gojo.
Nick, what do you mean Gojo's only the second strongest sorcerer of all time in JJK?
Yes. Actually, and I'm not talking about Sukuna. By the way, it actually feels important to note before we move on to Gojo, we should go over all of the cursed techniques that Yuta has access to. So obviously his innate technique that's imbued to him through his connection to Rika is copy. Now with his copy ability, he's copied cursed techniques like cursed speech from Inamaki, Shikigami technique that he copied from Druv that allows him to take his hair and turn them into Shikigami that he can fire that are essentially mini versions of Rika, the sky manipulation ability he took from Takoko that allows him to turn any tangible surface into a lens that he's able to distort, Thin Icebreaker, another technique he took from Takoko, where he strikes the air in front of his opponent, which shatters the air, amplifying the effect of the attack. He has Technique Extinguishment and Maximum Output Jacob's Ladder from Hana, a technique that allows him to eradicate all cursed spirits, or to destroy a cursed object, or to separate a cursed object from a person. He has G Warstaff from Charles Bernard that allows him to see into the future of the person whose blood he gets into his staff, though technically he imbues that technique into his katana. He has the Shrine after consuming 2 of Yuji's fingers, which he still has because Yuji's never healed the fingers. He has the body swapping technique of Kenjaku, and then all of the limitless abilities, red, blue, purple, and unlimited void, which means he technically has 2 domain expansions, the only person in existence outside of Kenjaku to do that. Okay, now we can talk about Gojo, the supposed strongest. What do you want me to say about Gojo that hasn't been said already? He beat the ever-living hell out of Miguel. He finished off Geto. The entire world revolves around him because he's so incredibly strong. Kenjaku's entire plan in the Shibuya incident was to seal him away in the prison realm because Kenjaku knew he wasn't strong enough to take out Gojo. Gojo was able to battle toe-to-toe against the likes of Sukuna, and the only reason that Sukuna was able to come out victorious over Gojo is because Maharaga showed Sukuna how to cut through the infinity, and therefore without Sukuna swapping into Megami's body and being able to summon Maharaga, there's a fair chance Gojo would have won that fight, even though after Gojo dies, he's like, oh, I guess Sukuna was way stronger than me. No, he wasn't. You literally almost killed him with your final purple. And yes, Sukuna always had the ability to transform into his real form, but transforming into his real form got rid of his access to the 10 shadows. Gojo was able to compete in multiple domain clashes against Sukuna and came out victorious in about half of them. Gojo was able to take Malevolent Shrine slashes, healing them immediately. Gojo is probably the first person in history to find out he could use RCT on the part of his brain that controls cursed techniques. So after his cursed techniques were fried from a domain expansion clash, he'd be able to get them back immediately. His Hollow Purple is undoubtedly the most impressive and most dangerous offensive technique in all of JJK. His domain expansion Unlimited Void is undoubtedly the greatest domain expansion in all of JJK. He was able to accomplish basically the same amount, if not more, than the entirety of the Kusakabe Coalition, and he was able to do it against a Sukuna that I genuinely believe was technically stronger than the Sukuna the Kusakabe Coalition fought. Yes, that Sukuna had 2 mouths and 4 arms, but that Sukuna also didn't have access to the 10 shadows. And the reason that Sukuna didn't have access to the 10 shadows is thanks to none other than Gojo. His control over gravity and anti-gravity through the means of blue and red allowed for him to teleport instantaneously, making him probably the fastest person in the entire JJK universe. And he's so powerful that Sukuna at one point yelled like a little girl from Maharaga and threw a fire extinguisher at him. Took it as a fraud. Gojo was stronger. He didn't deserve what he got. I'm not coping. But even Gojo, the self-proclaimed strongest, is not the strongest Jujutsu sorcerer in the entirety of JJK. No, because that honor belongs to one man and one man alone, and that man is Takaba. The man who not only 1v1'd Kenjaku into a situation where Kenjaku got his head cut off, but the man that's so incredibly powerful that if he thought killing Sukuna was funny, he would have. The man is so incredibly powerful that if he thought cursed spirits weren't that funny, and that a world without them would be funnier, cursed spirits would disappear. The man who is only nerfed by the fact that he doesn't understand his own ability and probably never will. A man so powerful that he was able to either bring Kenjaku or Geto back to life, even though Kenjaku or Geto's body had already been consumed by Rika. A man whose curse technique allows him to not listen to the bounds of reality in his own universe. Takaba. And while yes, Takaba doesn't kill, that's only because Takaba currently doesn't find death funny. If one day Takaba starts finding death funny, well then, the GG's world, because Takaba's curse technique, the comedian, allows him to make anything he finds funny reality. It's been stated multiple times in this manga that if Takaba ever figured out how to use his technique, he'd be stronger than Gojo. And therefore, who am I to argue with the manga? Because, well, yes, technically Takaba does lose in a fight to Kenjaku. That's only because Kenjaku understands how Takaba's technique works, and Takaba doesn't. Kenjaku identifies that all Takaba wants in life is to be a part of a very funny and successful comedy duo. And so Kenjaku gives him exactly that, which leads to Takaba being so happy he could die. But he doesn't die. In fact, Kenjaku dies, but not for long because apparently Takaba is able to bring the dead back to life, even if their body has been completely consumed by a cursed spirit. So even though Gojo claims to be the strongest, considering the fact that Gojo is in a ridiculously powerful reality warper, you can't give him the #1 spot. But if Gojo ever creates an entire sea out of Fanta and then frolics in it, maybe I'll consider him stronger than Takaba. But until then, Takaba takes the top spot. And with that, you have the definitive and final top 10 strongest sorcerers in JJK. But I'm curious to hear what you guys think. If you had to rank the top 10 strongest Jujutsu sorcerers in JJK, what would your list look like? Would Takaba be #1? Would Yuji be #5? Would Maki make the list? Tell me in the comments below. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. It's Friday night, it's Saturday, Sunday.